Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Today we're going to spend our time looking at a variety of different issues over the next couple of hours. And in this first hour, we're going to be talking about a ministry that you need to know about called Six Stones. Next hour, we're going to be talking about Paul and his team, and I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. In the third hour, we'll get into some other issues in the news. Lots to talk about today. My co-host for today is Cynthia Wenz, and you may have heard her before on this program, and we'll talk a little bit later about her book, Healed for Life, and lives in Houston. But thank you for coming up today to be a co-host with me.
So glad to be here.
I am so excited to hear from you, and we're going to hear your story a little bit later, but we want to get right to Scott Sheppard, an individual that I've crossed paths with before, a man who used to listen to Point of View on a pretty regular basis, right?
All the time. It was a staple for me every day.
Well, it's just great to have you in studio. And again, we have to talk about this. A Euless native, an individual that graduated in architecture, worked in construction, and then all of a sudden finds himself at First Baptist Euless, and then is reassigned to Six Stones. And you got to say, how did a person who was an architect and a construction person end up doing what you're doing today?
Well, I still haven't figured that out. I just tell people it's been a series of left turns all my life. So God's got a sense of humor, and we're just trying to follow him. Right?
Well, it is amazing. And you did bring in one of the books by Reggie McNeil, which I really appreciate, Kingdom Collaborators. And here you really got a nice mention, because he says, I ran into one of these stories about, helping an entire community when I met Scott Sheppard, the executive director of Six Stones Ministry in Euless, Texas. In 2008, Scott was serving as the missions pastor at First Baptist Church of Euless, watching their middle-class bedroom community of Dallas transform into an ethnically and economically diverse city with 119 nations represented, speaking 70 languages. Increasingly, people were facing economic challenges on multiple fronts, from dilapidated housing to food insecurity. And the church made, of course, a courageous script-flipping decision, and we're going to talk about that. Anybody who's watched your videos, it starts out by saying this whole ministry started with a miracle. Explain that, if you might.
Well, it really did, and I have to rewind the tape to 2004. We were a 100-year-old Southern Baptist church, and in Dallas-Fort Worth, that's pretty unique. And so in April, it was the greatest year in the life of our church. By September, it became the worst year in the life of our church, because we had built a brand new worship center 5 years prior to that, and we thought we were pretty close to paying that thing off. We thought we were pretty hot stuff. And the reality came out that we were actually bankrupt. We had squandered everything that we had, spent all the cash. I could go into great details, but God really put us on the brink. And I would say we were probably insolvent, and we didn't think we would make the end of the year. In February of 2005, Bill Anderson, our interim pastor, came in. He preached a message out of Zechariah 4, 6, and 7. And basically, I'll paraphrase, "Who are you, O mountain? I'll make you a plain. It's not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, said the Lord." And so in the course of 27 months, we were able to pay off $6.2 million in debt. We put money back into accounts. We had an Indonesian church, a Romanian church, and a crisis pregnancy center that we had robbed all their cash too. And God restored it all.
Wow.
And so, but in the middle of that, Bill Anderson made a comment. He said, if you were a debt-free church, what could you do? How many water wells could you drill? How many missionaries could you send? And so that's really what we thought our future was going to be in 2008. I was in Venezuela, Mexico, Africa. We helped with the Mandarin Chinese translation of the Bible. We planted a church in Texas, Arizona, New York. And then we realized, wow, we're not doing anything in our Jerusalem. And it was really a left turn, another left turn, talking to City Hall. We had an agenda as a church, and the city said, that's not what we need help with. And they posed for us a couple months later an opportunity to really lean in and help them.
Right.
They said if we were really serious about it. And so we did, and that's really what birthed. It captivated the hearts of our people. We actually launched a nonprofit in less than 90 days, so captivated them, and the rest has been kind of history as we're trying to figure it out.
Well, and again, if I can quote from him one more time here, he talks about the word hope shows up time and time again. You know, you have the New Hope Center, you have a Night of Hope. There are all sorts of things that use the word hope. And again, that's another kind of theme. It's going to take a few minutes really to even talk about all the different things that you do. But let's start with the easy one, construction. You know all about that. And he mentioned dilapidated homes.
Absolutely.
You went from a time when that was an upscale suburban neighborhood to one where there were a lot of homes that needed a lot of work. Is that
Absolutely, fair? Absolutely. Of course, about 40 years, you've got a lot of families that have moved in for Bell Helicopter and all those great things. We look like Frisco or Alliance or, you know, the Woodlands down in Houston even. And just over time, things change. Things begin to move. And unfortunately, we had not paid attention. And we went to the city. We had a little bit of an agenda to go help some families and kids at Christmas with firemen. And I got to be truthful here and honest. We thought we were going to evangelize firemen. And the city said, no, what we need help with is we've got these homeowners that are struggling. And matter of fact, if you rewind the tape to 2008, we know what the economy was doing.
Yes.
It was cratering.
It was cratering.
And so every city, I don't care which city, every city in America has got a code enforcement issue, and they have no solution for it. And that's where the city said, if you could help us with that, maybe we can do something together. So we just unashamedly said yes. We have a motto at our shop. It's amazing what you can do when you don't know you shouldn't have done it. And we leaned in, and we actually worked on one house and did the typical thing. We went home and thought, hey, we did our event. And that was the captivation.
That was like 400 houses ago, right?
Actually, 600 houses ago.
Yeah, 600.
Yeah.
Last time I saw it was 400.
Yeah,
So
it's
up to
climbing
600.
quickly.
Unbelievable. You need to change your videos because that's the last one I saw.
There you go.
Cynthia, what do you think about this? Isn't this amazing?
Well, I think a man on mission at church was sent out. I want to hear about the struggle when you were sent out to actually do this undertaking. You say we, and it can sound like you're still with the church, and the church did do the undertaking. But what about when you were sent? And I want to hear about the wrestle in your heart.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I think that's when we're all called to the mission field.
Right.
There's that moment. I want to hear about that moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we made the announcement. Our pastor sowed the seed to the congregation, so we're going to launch a nonprofit. We don't know what it's going to look like, and we're looking for that person. And, of course, he came to me and said, I need you to go build a coalition of churches, businesses, nonprofits, and other entities. I need you to go meet the needs of this community. And I said, I don't know how to do that, and I'm not interested. Now, I'm going to be very spiritual because my mom had worked in the clothing pantry for many, many years across the street. I really didn't want to hand out pinto beans and blue jeans with senior adult women. That didn't sound very appealing to me. And so I fought it for a long time until actually my call to ministry, since you asked, is the book of Nehemiah.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
And when you go back and look at the great prophets that were bringing back the wave of Jews to Jerusalem, we started to rebuild the temple. Once we got to that place, Nehemiah had to come back and rebuild the city so then we could rebuild people. And I knew God spoke to me then and said, you are the guy. You've got to go do this. And so we just took off. Like I said, it's amazing what you can do. You don't know what you should do because we thought we were just going to feed people. We had no idea what he had in store for us relationally with city and school districts and all of those things. So.
And I love that you mentioned Nehemiah. When I think of Nehemiah, I think of chapter, I don't know if it's 3 or 4, but where literally the father and the daughters walk outside their front door and they build their part of the wall.
That's right. And
talking with you earlier, you have a diverse crowd coming to help, not just the church.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that.
You bet. Well, back to what I said a minute ago, my charge was, and it's still our mission statement this day, is I need you to build a coalition of churches. And what I said to him, and this was really the linchpin, was what you said was kingdom, not Baptist, not Pentecostal, you said kingdom. And that was very appealing to me because, now I phrase it a little bit different. We like to say it takes the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker to actually find their part.
Father, daughters, butcher, baker. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We need to take a break, but we have a lot more to cover. And if you find yourself saying, I want to know more about this ministry, we have a link to sixstones.org. That's the number 6 stones. But again, we have the link there. We have information about Cynthia and Scott on our website. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisers they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Hey, this is John Stonestreet, the host of Breakpoint and the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. As a champion of Christians thinking clearly about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview, there are a few people that I look to for more clarity and confidence and providing clear answers to the big questions that our culture is asking. And Kerby Anderson, I love what happens on Point of View each and every day. And anytime I get the opportunity to be a guest on the program, I always think that Kerby is the best interviewer in the business. I encourage you to support Point of View with your prayers and with your financial support.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Last week we had Truth Team, and I just thought I'd mention that we're still looking for your financial support. And some of you have asked, what's the status of the match? We had a little bit left over, so you certainly could still qualify for that match, which means a gift of $1 becomes $2. And if you wanted to give $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, that qualifies you to be part of the Truth Team. Or, of course, if you'd like to make a one-time gift of $100, that becomes $200. So go to the website, pointofview.net. Of course, we have a pledge line, 800-347-5151. Co-host with me, Cynthia Wenz, and also in the studio with us, Scott Sheppard, and that is Six Stones Ministry. Cynthia?
Thanks so much, Kerby. You know, Scott, I'm looking at your website, sixstones.org, and I see NOH, Night of Hope, and I love it. It says you, your organization, and most importantly, there's so many different ways to celebrate and be involved with Night of Hope. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'll rewind the tape real quick. We actually began in our school district with a back-to-school event. Lots of churches, lots of groups do them, but we began to build a working relationship with our school district, so much so that the superintendent, and we sat down and figured out which kids and all that, but he came to us and said, hey, I really want to help you, but what is it that you'd like to do? You've blessed so many of our families and so many of our kids. What would you like to accomplish? And I said, well, Mom's going to make a really bad decision at Christmas. And I'd like to be involved in that process because she's going to want to have the same Christmas for her kids that every other mom wants. But she's not going to pay the light bill or the rent or something. And so if we can step in and take care of that for you and for our community, would that be okay? And he said, sure. So what we've evolved into, and matter of fact, I told him too, he said, how are you going to do that? I said, I'm going to do it like I did when I was in third grade many years ago. And we're going to have parents, and we're going to have a Christmas party, and we're going to have gifts and cake and punch and cookies. And then we were asked to go out into the hallway and sit on our bottoms Indian style and be real quiet as someone read the true Christmas story to us, not the winter holiday break story. And he said, is that what you want to do? And I said, yes, that's what I want to do. So we've launched that. We started in 8 schools. Now in our school district, we're in all 20 schools over 4 nights. It is a zoo. We will support over 4,000 kiddos, but it engages our back to our cities, our PD, school district, corporate, faith. Everybody's involved. It takes an entire village to pull this thing off, but everybody's involved in it.
And we talked about salvations as well. So do you experience some of those salvations at this Night of Hope as well?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we don't all, I love what John Metter, our pastor at First Sheila, says. We don't all believe the same, but we all want the same thing for our families. But we find a way in everything we do to be able to share the love of Christ and let someone have that on-ramp. And they may not believe that way. That's okay. That's not a qualification to be there and be blessed, right? But if they want to have and know more about a relationship, we've got a partnering church at every one of those campuses where they can have that conversation and then hopefully integrate into the life of that church as well.
I love the church and the parachurch present. You're doing your part. The church is present to receive God's child, and the story's out. How many salvations?
We have seen in that one event alone over 3,800 people in the last 9 years.
Wow.
And in totality, our ministry's seen about 6,700. So
let's talk about how people can connect up, because Cynthia was talking about your website. It's 6stones.org.
Yes.
You have cities, schools, businesses, churches, all sorts of things, a place where people can join the coalition, where you have community-powered revitalization, a place where people can donate. And I think, first of all, give us the venue, because there are a lot of people listening in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex right now on this particular station. They're saying, okay, I don't live in Euless, so I guess it doesn't qualify. But no, that's not the case, is it?
Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, we've got folks coming from all over this weekend. It's our big spring blitz.
Yes.
We'll work on 40 houses in 2 days with about 1,400 of our closest friends in 5 cities.
Right.
So
It's no small undertaking. It does. Goodness.
It's a zoo, but it's a lot of fun. So we'd love for you to come. Matter of fact, we offer a thing. You can call our office. We offer a thing called Backstage.
Okay.
Because we have cities from across the state, and actually even we got folks coming from Oklahoma this week down to see, back to that code enforcement issue, what can we do and how do we do that? And sometimes it's a city manager, sometimes it's a pastor, sometimes it's a business leader that says, hey, we need this. And so we'd love for you to come and see, have a good time. But more than anything, what we've been working on for the last couple of years is figuring out how we can package this up and help other communities. We've helped some in East Texas. I've got a group up in Azle. We're working with 2 cities down in the Katy area and also in Angleton, actually outside of Atlanta, and as far as Modesto, California. So
wow.
We want to share. We would love every community in America to see what is happening in our backyard.
So again, we've talked about a little bit of the New Hope Center. We certainly talked about the Night of Hope, and we've talked about the building. You also have Operation Back to School. That's something that would be helpful. You sort of alluded to that, but talk about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. School district came to us because right now, I don't care where you are in the nation, we're facing insecurity and a lot of challenges. Our school systems, especially in Texas, have had a hard time financially, but at the same time, they need resources. I will tell you now, there's even House Bill 5 in the Texas Senate that is now challenging school districts to step out and build collaborations. That's new. Mm-hmm. And so they came to us and said, would you help us with a back-to-school event? And that happens with a lot of churches. But what we were intentional about was building that relationship with the administration. So it's not collect a bunch of pencils and hand it out. We actually start in February. We We build this kit to their specifications. That's what they needed. That's what they wanted. We actually then work with them on identifying which kids qualify for this through the free and reduced lunch program. They actually do the distribution on the marketing. And then we spend all summer raising funds like crazy, but then we bring them together right before school starts, and we incorporate back to the firemen and the policemen and city council and companies and churches all in this social service fair to say, we love you. We absolutely love you. And so it's really about building the relationship and that collaborative initiative inside a district, not just putting on an event.
Makes me think of the kindness of Christ. Mm-hmm. How is Christ known? By his kindness, and the kindness you show the kids and the districts and the parents.
Absolutely. Without
words, just showing up and being present. How big is your staff?
Right now we're at 19. So
19.
Gideon's Army.
But let's talk about, again, how people can be involved, because this is an opportunity for our listeners right now to say, you know, I know I'm supposed to help the poor. I'm supposed to help the disadvantaged. I live in a nice neighborhood. I don't even know where they are, except when maybe I drive up to a stoplight and there's somebody panhandling. I don't really have a way to do this. There's a way with our time, our talent, and our treasure to make a difference. And so talk about how people listening right now can participate with you.
And do they have to be skilled?
No, not whatsoever. Matter of fact, we use senior adults to deliver lunches on top of that out to the workers. We've got a whole system involved in that. Everybody can have a piece. They used to say for years, right, it takes a village to raise a child, but it actually takes the village to take care of the village. And so you've got to get everybody engaged in it. You were talking about sons and daughters and parents, but it's the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the city councilman, the pastor. You all have to have a piece in it. So everything is derived on that for us. How do you find a way for everybody to have something involved in that? That's critical. It's very critical. Unfortunately, too, I think the church is waking up now and saying, hey, we want to go do something, but we're going to do it our way and on our time with our people. You have a lid. I'm telling you right now, if you can get past that lid and open this thing up and be inclusive, it's amazing what God will do. That's what he's done with us. It's just building those relationships and being inclusive in the process.
You also mentioned that you have a place for everyone. Let me just talk to those people that do know how to hold a hammer, do know how to use a gun and a number of other things so that they can actually help you build some of those houses. Absolutely. Or individuals that have teaching skills or a variety of other things. So certainly you can use anybody with any skills, but there's no maximum skills that disqualify you from being involved either, right?
Not whatsoever. We get into some tough situations. And so for us, we have what we call site captains on every house. And it is those guys you're talking about, Kerby, that kind of know, but they're the generals that make it happen. And then you've got, as you said a while ago, you've got all the way down to the unskilled. Everybody can have a piece, we start at 12 years old and we go all the way up. But most of this is not real extensive. It's not hard.
One more time, again, sixstones.org. Is that the best way for people to contact you?
Absolutely. Go to the website, take a look. Glance at the videos, but holler at us. We would love to engage you and be a part of what we're doing, and we'd love to help. So we got questions, call us.
Cynthia, I'm going to give everybody an assignment, and that is they have some nice videos there, and if they click on that video or even the video we're making right now and hit that share button, put it on your Facebook page, educate a few more people about Six Stones Ministry, and encourage everybody to get involved. Scott, it's great to see you. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you for the opportunity.
We're going to take a break, and then we're going to spend a lot more time learning from Cynthia. And there's a lot to talk about, but we need to take a break, so we'll be back right after these important messages.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute here for two very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week, we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5155 5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. Co-host still in studio with me, Cynthia Wenz. And again, if you're not familiar with her, we have a link to Healed for Life Ministries, also healedforlifebook.com. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Of course, she works with CareNet, which is just an outstanding organization. But I was very impressed with Scott Sheppard, and he left a copy of the book by Reggie McNeil, where he's mentioned a couple of times in this book, and it's one of those topics that we like to cover from time to time here on Point of View, and I'm glad that we could educate our listeners, and I just hope some of our listeners say, it's a great ministry. I should get involved with that.
It is a great ministry, and I love the part, changing the narrative of an entire community. And that's exactly what Six Stones is doing.
Yes, well, and we've seen this. I have another friend that's in a church that originally was, again, an upscale, suburban, fairly affluent community, and within literally less than a generation, was this example I thought was so interesting. In that particular area in Euless, 119 nations represented, speaking 70 different languages. And so one of the things the church began to do is ESL, just begin to talk about English as a second language and then begin to minister to all those needs. You can imagine coming here as a legal or even an illegal immigrant, and you're in a community and you don't speak English very well, you don't understand the services, and you're just stuck. And so, again, this is an opportunity for us to reach out to our Jerusalem. So I was really excited about this.
Absolutely, me too.
Well, let's talk about you for just a few minutes. You've been on the program with us before. We have information about your book, Healed for Life, A Story of Redemption. An incredible story, because you are one of the examples we talk about of women exploited by abortion, women having to seek comfort and grace in the midst of that. But since then, you've said, instead of just wallowing in all of this, I've been involved, and you're the regional director for CareNet. Talk about that.
I am. I just joined CareNet in January. I'm thrilled. January 15th, I'm a regional director, so I get to travel from Texas to California, talking about the good news of Jesus Christ and changing lives, saving babies from the womb, impacting the lives of mothers, impacting the lives of fathers. It's great. It takes my heart for the ministry to the nations and to our 1,100 pregnancy centers nationwide.
I might just mention, too, if you find yourself, of course, we're right now broadcasting in Dallas, but if you find yourself in other communities and you say, I don't know where there is a pregnancy help center in that community, go to CareNet, because they have that affiliation and have been able to identify these outstanding organizations and these ministries that existed virtually. As a matter of fact, we have, I think I heard last time, 3 times as many pregnancy help centers as we have abortion clinics.
That is exactly right.
Yeah. So, again, that's just a great way to find that out. And I've seen the legacy of this. Last week we had our Truth team, and one of the individuals speaking for us was Jim McKee, and he's the one that started the Dallas Pregnancy Center. Back then it was called Save a Life. And then, of course, I've seen that grow a little bit further, and then it became the Dallas Pregnancy Resource Center. And as I've shared with you off air, I might as well talk about on air, I speak at all sorts of pregnancy centers. But more than that, my wife worked there for a while. My daughter worked there for a while. And just the other day, I saw a story about this young girl that's come to work at what's now called Thrive. And she was one saved in a previous generation by that same particular group. So I want to get them in here to talk about that. So here you have a young girl who was saved because her mother decided not to abort her and actually save her. And now that young girl is working at the pregnancy center.
And thrive is an amazing word. That's exactly right, because she's a life that is thriving. She's a life that was preserved, and she can firsthand say, just like my son, I have a son that survived an abortion.
Yes.
And I remember when he was 8 years old, we were on TV, and in his age level, he just looked at the camera and he said, I'm what's inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's a known fact, but now he has a life that is thriving, and he's a father to my grandson, Titus. And Titus is a miracle. Roman survived. Now Titus is here. And while every child is a gift, you just look and think, wow.
Yeah. Well, and we've had even individuals that have worked in the pro-life center that said, when we do the calculation for the number of babies saved, well, that's only those babies. You just think if you save those, then there are others that come afterwards. You know, so really when you talk about saving whatever the number is, thousands, it could be more than that, because if you save those, then you have others that are able to have children. So you have 3 generations.
And I'm now experiencing the generational impact of that.
That's great.
That's exactly right.
So what would you say to listeners right now to how to maybe counsel a friend that is considering abortion? You know, there used to be called crisis pregnancy centers, because a woman who's pregnant finds herself in a crisis. And I've heard you in various venues by watching you on video talk about the fact she can't think about tomorrow. She certainly can't think long term. She can't think about the psychological, physiological, medical consequences of that. So what would you suggest if we find ourselves wanting to maybe begin to counsel somebody who is convinced that abortion is the only answer to her problems.
Well, just like the Lord said, fear not. That's the first thing, fear not.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes when you're looking at someone in that situation, and we use the word crisis, but I don't think the child was a crisis to God.
Yes.
I think God knew about the child. So we've kind of gotten away from that term because the pregnancy itself is not unknown.
Right.
But her state, her emotional state, her dealing with her current situation. So I say to the person sitting across from her, fear not, because the number one thing is be present, be unafraid.
Right.
And sometimes not having the answer is okay, but loving and being present and saying, I can't imagine what you're going through, but I'm here and I'm here with you and I'm willing to journey. Thessalonians says we share our very lives. Ephesians 6:4 says we take them by the hand. And sometimes it's that being present for that person. Do you know who the number one influencer is in a woman's decision to choose life or to terminate a pregnancy?
No.
The father of the child.
Father.
And so in our modern day rhetoric, it's her body, it's her choice, it's her life. I think it's 96% of the time she is saying her number one influencer, the reason she chose not to carry the pregnancy or to carry the pregnancy was the father, the father of that baby. So the first conversation to have is, where's the father?
Where's the father?
Let's talk. If he's the number one influencer and that's what statistics are telling us, well, let's address the father, not in condemnation, not in judgment, but to say, let's sit down. Let's discuss this. What are the options?
And then sometimes they have somebody that's really having an influence. Now, it could be the father, it could be the mother, or something else that's forcing her to do something that she's not really sure she wants to do, right? So that's another thing to begin to pay attention to.
Well, and that was me at 15.
Yeah.
You know, my mother, I was the child of Philadelphia Italian people, and my father was full-blooded Italian, and my mother said, your father's going to kill you.
Yeah.
And she wasn't acting maliciously. She just wasn't thinking.
Yeah.
Your father's going to kill you. I've got to help you. This was the help that was offered. I was 15 years old. Mom, I get it. And off you go. And here comes termination number one. And so my mom and I have talked about that. You know, we remember that child and we have found love and forgiveness for one another. She did the best that she could then. But at the moment, the 15-year-old didn't have the maturity to think for herself. And so you're right, there's a lot of influencers.
Well, and the other part of that, which we now have better resources than we used to, is to be able to show a pregnant woman the baby inside the womb. You know, before we had, and I'm old enough to remember when we used to do pregnancy centers where we didn't have ultrasound, we didn't have sonograms and those kinds of things. That's one of the reasons why to this day, if they actually have to do an ultrasound in Planned Parenthood, they move the screen away, because the moment that mother sees her baby, that changes everything, doesn't it?
Well, you know, in 2011, Roman and I testified in the House of Representatives when the bill was on the floor. I think it was House Bill 15, and it was, should a woman see that scan before a termination procedure? And I'll never forget, Roman was 14 at the time, and I took him to see our state capitol in action, and we stood up. They called my name, 12 hours in the House of Representatives waiting for your turn to testify. And I stand up, and he leans over and says, Mom, I think I want to walk up with you. And, at a teenager level, I said, pray and ask the Lord, and I'll honor whatever decision the Lord tells you to do. You say yes. He says no. You say no. He says yes. And he felt led to come up. We go up to the front. And I say to the panel, gentlemen, what was inside of me, Roman was my third termination. He was a twin that survived. I did not see a scan before that termination. And I said, gentlemen, what we didn't get when I went back for the checkup was my son. So the question is informed consent, like we discussed earlier. Did I have a right to see what was in my womb prior to termination so that I could make a fully informed consent? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If you're going to extract a molar, there's several x-rays that are taken. Of course, I should see what is inside my womb to make an informed decision. And of course, House of Representatives chairman said to Roman, "It's the best thing I've seen all day, son."
Great story. Need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Cynthia, and if you'd like to know more about her incredible testimony, and certainly we have information about her book, A Story of Redemption, which is entitled Healed for Life. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so. And then a little bit later, we're going to be talking about Paul and his team. That'll be our conversation in the second hour today. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At this point, it's an all-too-familiar story. A same-sex couple asks a religious baker to custom-create a wedding cake. Despite apologetically declining the business, the baker is sued and the bakery is forced to close. But this is not that story. Not yet, anyway. Kathy Miller is the religious baker, and her bakery, called Tastries, is located in Bakersfield, California. She was forced to decline some business when that client would have required her to use her creative expression to lend support to a union that violates her religious convictions. The couple filed a complaint, and the state of California filed suit against Kathy. But Judge David Lamp concluded that the state has an obligation to protect free speech for everyone, including Kathy. The court reasoned that while everyone should be able to purchase ready-made goods regardless of what the customer plans to do with the goods, custom art is different. Or, as the ACLU says, freedom of expression for ourselves requires freedom of expression for others. You see, the true test of whether we actually believe in the promise of the First Amendment is speech we find socially controversial. Popular ideas are not in great danger of being suppressed or silenced. The true test of our commitment to freedom is if we welcome that disagreement and live peaceably as neighbors anyway. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Point of View is a part of my daily life, and I know of no other radio program that helps its listeners to develop, articulate, and then defend a biblical worldview as successfully as yours does. For those reasons, I consider it an honor to be able to support Point of View financially, and I would encourage all of your listeners, both young and old, to prayerfully consider doing the same.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know I was working in an abortion clinic when abortion first became legal, and I thought I was helping women. And the Lord showed me in a very powerful way, as He removed the veil from me, what exactly I'd been involved in. And I am proof of forgiveness. And I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Cynthia Wenz in studio with us for a few more minutes, and one of the testimonies from a woman that worked in an abortion clinic and then saw the light and left the abortion clinic and can testify to the truthfulness of life and stands for life. And so, certainly that's what you've been doing for these many years
Absolutely. Now. And, you know, I was just thinking, abortion sometimes in the millennial generation, they think it makes them unpregnant, as though the pregnancy has never existed. I had 3 terminations. As a mother, I still think about
I'm sure
my 36-year-old child that I never knew, my 31-year-old child, my 21-year-old twin to my 21-year-old twin who survived. That was a bizarre moment in my life. But an abortion doesn't make you unpregnant. There's a lasting memory that goes with that. And so how to reconcile that and how to make a healthy choice to look to the future well.
Let's talk about that, because you mentioned this idea of informed consent. In almost every medical procedure, you have to have informed consent. As a matter of fact, I used to say that when my kids were in school, I had to do 2 things. I was an ATM machine giving out money, and I was a signature signer, because I had to, for anything they did.
Even an aspirin.
Yes, it was just amazing. Yet when it comes to abortion, all those ideas get thrown out the window, don't they?
Out the window. And these women, even young women, especially young women now, very wise, very aware. They're very aware it's a life, but they're also very self-conscious about their life. And so sometimes we get a little skewed, save the baby.
Yeah.
But we have to address that she is a life as well, and a life worth caring for and being addressed. And so informed consent begins that dialogue of not just pointing out there's life in the womb. I think she's pretty well aware of that. But how can we get through the relationship with the father of the baby? How can we get through what her future might or might not look like? Roland Warren, our CEO of CareNet, got pregnant, junior at Princeton with his wife. And, you know, I remember when he tells his testimony, Yvette, you'll never be the doctor you wanted to be. She's a thriving doctor. Chose life for her son. They now have 2 beautiful sons. They have a grandson of their own. It's part of the narrative. Let's think beyond the moment.
Right. Well, and one of the other things you're talking about is we want to involve the father and the mother. And one of the other things I've noticed, Cynthia, is when I go to these Pregnancy Resource Center banquets, I can never think of a time where I've been at one of these banquets where we haven't heard about individuals coming to know the Lord. And just a while ago, we talked with Scott Sheppard about the thousands of individuals that have become Christians because of that good action that was taking place. These pregnancy centers are some of the most effective evangelistic outreaches in the country. Now, the goal is to save the baby, not to save souls, but it saves souls as well. And it's just one more aspect of the incredible ministry that these pregnancy centers have around the country.
Well, and especially with the shift to pregnancy medical centers, pregnancy resource centers, their education centers, their medical centers. They're doing STD, STI testing and treatment. If you think about that, that's prevention. If she's sexually active, she will contract a sexually transmitted disease. 1 in 4 teens are statistically going to contract a disease. Well, that dialogue and that relationship that happens because it's education, empowerment, information. So you build that relationship and you form a stronger community. So there's so much going on in the resource center, and you're addressing her spirit, mind, and body. So body is the medical component, mind is the educational component, and the spiritual component. I remember in my 3rd abortion, I went to the church and said, God will forgive me one more time, won't he? It's a thought that crosses her mind. What is the spirit life of myself if I make this decision? And just having a dialogue, not a scare tactic dialogue. Let's talk about that. What is that conversation?
Well, again, one of the other ministries of pregnancy centers is to really begin to minister to women who've been exploited by abortions, who many times can't forgive themselves and cannot seek the grace of Christ. So certainly, again, that's just one more ministry that exists there as well.
23 years of living in unforgiveness. I knew the Lord had forgiven me, but I could not forgive myself. And that comes with a whole plethora of challenges. So Christ is the reason that I can talk with you so openly about my children in heaven, whom I long to see. It's not a careless statement to say, yes, you know, I've had abortions. No, it's a heartfelt thing to say, I have children in heaven, and to be able to know where they are and to long to see them. That's the reconciliation of Christ in my life and the redemption.
What I wanted to talk about just before we run out of time is what's available on your website. First of all, of course, you can get a copy of the book published by Lucid, I think it was.
Yes,
and it's
correct.
been Healed for Life, A Story of Redemption. Just a fascinating book. Matter of fact, Amazon #1 new release and top 10 bestseller in abortion and birth control. So that's the first thing. Number 2, there's a button there for contact. And I suspect a lot of people like now are saying, I would like to have her come and speak to our group, to women's group. I'd like to have her come and speak at our pregnancy center. I'd like to have her come and maybe challenge our church to develop an outreach to women. So is that available as well?
You know, Revelation 12:11, Christ is made known by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. You never fill out your resume and say, I'd like to fillet myself wide open and tell every dirty part of my life on stage to hundreds of thousands of people. And then the Lord calls you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he asks you to do. It's my honor to speak the testimony. He's so kind to remind me my history is his story, as we know, and he uses that testimony to break open many hearts in the audience and to make the truth of the choices that are available to us known. And yes, I'm available to speak.
Let me just mention that there's a contact form that you can fill out.
Correct.
But next to your picture here, we also have a number of links. Those are, for example, the Twitter feed and Facebook page and a variety of others. So there's a lot of ways people can connect up with you, right?
As a matter of fact, on page 105 in my book,
Mm-hmm.
I had a wise pastor say to me, you really ought to put your phone number in the book. And I looked at him. He said, Bob Goff does it. At the end of his book, he puts his number, and he's the master at that first connect.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, Lord, and immediately my heart said, yes, page 105, my number's in the book. Because if God's breaking open the heart of another sister, I'm going to be the first one to receive that heart.
That's wonderful. We are just about out of time in this segment, but what happens in your life next? Where are we going, and where will we have a chance to hear you speak?
Actually, I'll be at Christian Leadership Alliance this week.
Mm-hmm.
CareNet has a ministry briefing on Friday morning. If you want to come have coffee, please join us. And then I'm at Bella House in December is my next one. And then in October, I'm in Alabama.
Yeah, so
I don't have the slate memorized, but on my website, you can certainly get some information.
So again, Cynthia has been our co-host in this first hour, and we had a chance to meet Scott. What a great ministry that is.
So honored to even just hear about Six Stones and the great outreach that they're doing in their Nehemiah community-changing effort.
And, of course, they've had a pregnancy center there as well. And, of course, then we connected up with you. So this has been really great, and I appreciate you dropping by. So we need to
Thanks
do it
for
again.
having me.
We've enjoyed having you in studio. Let me just mention as we go to a break here that we do have some information about our Truth Team. And as I've mentioned before, if you'd like to still join with us, I think we have a little bit of match money left, and that could be something where a gift of $50 becomes $100 or $100 becomes $200. But also consider maybe joining with us as the Truth Team. That's really simple. $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. All available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute here for two very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now, 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time looking at those who traveled with the Apostle Paul. And perhaps if more recently you had a chance to go to one of the movies we recommended, which was entitled Paul, the Apostle of Christ, you recognize that two of the principal featured individuals there are Priscilla and Aquila. You might say, I think I remember those names from the book of Acts, and they also show up in Corinth and a number of other places. If you've ever traveled to Greece, and especially gone to Corinth, they actually take you to a place where you see the name Erastus in the pavement, and so it gives verification for one of those individuals that traveled with Paul and was sent out by Paul in Acts 19. But who are some of those individuals, and how can we maybe learn some lessons from them as they are involved in taking some of these baby Christians and growing them, dealing with all sorts of cultural challenges that are going to be facing them, and how we can maybe learn from them today. So that's why we're going to be talking about this new book published by Moody entitled Paul and His Team, What the Early Church Can Teach Us About Leadership and Influence. It is written by Dr. Ryan Lokkesmoe, and he is the lead pastor of Real Hope Community Church in the Houston area. Has a master's degree in New Testament from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, also received his doctorate in New Testament at the University of Denver. And you may have seen his earlier book, which is entitled Blurry, Bringing Clarity to the Bible. And, of course, this new book, Paul and His Team. Of course, he lives in Richmond, Texas, and joins us now by phone. So, Ryan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
If nothing else, I would love to talk about your story for just a minute, because you talk about where you came from, and there was something that brought me back to some experiences that I had, because a number of years ago, before I was doing this radio program, we were speaking on college campuses. And one time or a couple of times, the Billy Graham organization asked us to go into the classrooms. And because of that, we actually generated a lot of enthusiasm for people to come out to the Billy Graham Crusade. And one of those places was at San Jose State University in 1981. And you mentioned that in your book, because we were very much involved in actually challenging students at San Jose State and around the San Francisco Bay Area community to come out to the crusade for San Jose State University. And that has a link actually fairly directly to you, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that event was where my mom placed her faith in Christ. She'd grown up in New England and pretty big Irish Catholic family, and so she'd been kind of, around the church, sort of, but just had never really understood the gospel for herself. And she got to know my dad, and they began dating in California in the late 70s. And my dad grew up as a believer. His dad, my grandfather, was a pastor and a U.S. Army chaplain. Mm-hmm. So my dad was a person of faith. But I think for him, it was a season of kind of renewal of faith, and then also getting to know my mom and seeing that she had kind of the beginnings of a faith. My dad would describe her as someone who sort of acted like a Christian but wasn't one, so he just felt like she was right there, and then heard Billy Graham was coming to the area and said, we've got to go. And so that event was the moment where my mom became a Christian really for the first time, and I think also a moment of renewal of faith for my dad. And so just so thankful for Billy Graham and his ministry, direct impact on my life.
Yeah, we used to do that for a couple places, and for our East Coast listeners, also was at places like Johns Hopkins and Towson State and a number of other places in Maryland, and a couple of places where the Graham organization used us because we would speak in the classrooms, and that would sometimes create a level of spiritual interest, and then they would come out here and hear Dr. Graham and become Christians. So anyway, just a footnote in your book, but it meant something to me, as I do remember vividly some of the hostility I faced on the San Jose State campus, but maybe it was all worthwhile. If nothing else, it was instrumental, even if indirectly, in the salvation of your mother. So let's talk about the book and how this came to be. Of course, you have worked on your doctorate, but this is one of those books where, after I saw it, I thought, this is one we probably should have written years ago because it's such a natural, and I want to thank you for putting it together because, after all, we can learn a great deal from those in the first century, and a lot of our listeners would, of course, know Jesus, and they would know Peter, and they know Paul, they might know Stephen, they might know James, but you help us understand that it was a team of individuals, some of whom names only maybe begin to resonate with us if we've been doing and teaching through the book of Acts, that are still very instrumental in the advance of the gospel.
Yeah, that's right. The idea for the book started a number of years ago. As you mentioned, when I was in my PhD coursework, I was focusing on the first century historical environment of the church, and I wrote my dissertation on the situation around Paul and Philemon and Onesimus,
right,
and what was going on there. And so I was very interested in the social setting of the first century church and kind of the challenges that they were facing. And I kind of just filed away in the back of my mind, wouldn't it be great if there was a book about the rest of Paul's team? Because Paul gets a lot of attention, rightfully so, because of his writings and his unique role as an apostle. But these other folks who were so instrumental in his ministry, who maybe only get mentioned in passing a few times here and there in the New Testament, I thought, man, that would be so inspirational, I think, for a lot of people to know the very important roles these people played and how God used them in powerful ways, even though they weren't kind of the front and center leader. And so I kind of filed that idea away, and I circled back around to it a couple years ago. And originally the idea for the book was just write a book about these people, maybe a chapter on Priscilla and Aquila, a chapter on Luke, a chapter on, Erastus, people like that. But as I got more into the project and talked with some people at Moody and my agent and others who were kind of involved in this idea, the light bulb moment was, this isn't a book that's just, gee whiz, let me tell you about these people. The purpose of telling you about these people is to show how God used them and how this group of people as a team, how they led and shared Christ with the world back then. And so that was kind of the light bulb moment where it shifted. It kind of flipped around. It's a leadership book. It's a book about our influence as Christians, and we're looking to Paul and the people on his team as examples, as case studies for how we should think about things, how we should approach our lives. It's certainly people in ministry can look to them as examples, but I think any person of faith can look at how they negotiated those challenges and find inspiration, because we're all influencing someone. Somebody is looking to us as an example. And so that was really kind of the focus of the book, is let's bring some of these people kind of out of obscurity and into the light and look at how God used them.
Let me take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of that, the quest for common ground and Watch the Burden and offstage leadership, and we'll work our way through 11 different chapters. May not cover all of those, but this resonated with me as a book. One, because I've been teaching through the book of Acts these last couple of months. Number two, because having gone to first Israel and then actually taking some of you that are listening in the listening audience to Greece, and we've had a chance to go to Philippi and Thessaloniki, as well as Athens and Corinth and Berea. This really is just a phenomenal book. So we'll come back and talk more about this book, Paul and his team, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisers they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now. Michael Youssef.
I tell you, I always look forward to being with you, Kerby. You truly give me a good intellectual challenge. In any way that you are gifted, what God called you to do, as long as you are involved in some way, and that is the plea I have with your listeners, Kerby, that please do not just listen to a program like this and then go, well, that was an interesting thing. No, I want to challenge you. Get involved. Find out what Kerby Anderson is doing. Find out what other ministries are doing. Get involved, because it is only when the believers really take their faith seriously that can we turn the world upside down. I believe that with all my heart.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
A little bit left over from last week. Of course, we had our Truth Team week last week, and again, just challenged you to consider what you might do to support this ministry so you can hear these kind of conversations, the one we're having today about Paul and his team. And again, we have just a little bit of match money left over. Usually we meet the match. We did not on Friday, so we've carried some of it over, which means, again, if you would want to make a special one-time gift, a gift of $50 becomes $100, $100 becomes $200. I do want to maybe find someone this hour that would want to join our Truth Team for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. You can join the Truth Team, and of course, we send you a welcome gift for that. We've in the past sent the Bible stick, which we still will provide for you at some of the higher giving levels, which you can find out at our website, pointofview.net. Find out how you can join at any level, and certainly there are some benefits to that as well. So again, the pledge line number 800-347-5151, or simply go to the website pointofview.net. Well, we still have a little of that match money on the table, and we won't interrupt our conversation with Ryan any longer than that, but just wanted to make that available to those of you that had been waiting to the very last day or hour to join with us. Talking about this new book, Paul and His Team, What the Early Church Can Teach Us About Leadership and Influence, published by our good friends at Moody. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link so that you can find that on the website if you'd like to order it online. And Ryan, let's, if we can, talk about the first chapter, and that is The Quest for Common Ground. We got a picture of you. I love this. First of all, I might just mention that as you go through this, there are discussion questions at the end. So if a church or a small group wanted to go through this book, they could go through these 11 chapters. But you also have some pictures, and there's pictures of the bronze plaque of Paul's speech in Acts 17. There's a picture of you on the Areopagus. There's a picture of the road of Dionysus and some of that. So there's a good illustration. Paul finds himself among the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and that's, if you will, kind of a hostile worldview. And in some respects, our 21st century world is a lot like the first century world that the Apostle Paul found himself is, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. You know, he was going into so many different environments. You know, there was in the broader Greco-Roman world. I mean, there were, you know, each city had its own kind of culture, and yes, it was antagonistic to his message in many different ways. And you know, that just as I mentioned earlier, as the concept of the book kind of flipped around to these case studies, these leadership lessons, I wanted to start the book out on the note of this quest for common ground, because you continually see Paul and the people around him doing this. They go into these environments so different from their background, their worldview, places like you mentioned, Athens, that was just a world away from, you know, the first century Palestinian context that so many of the early believers were from. And Paul, he didn't meet that antagonistic context with additional antagonism. He said, these are people that God loves, and I have a message that's life-giving for them. And so that's going to need to affect the way I talk about this stuff. And so, you know, just in God's providence, Paul comes from this background of course, being from a Jewish family, but having been raised in a Greco-Roman environment like Tarsus. He can speak their language. He knows the categories that in which they think, and so he takes this opportunity to seek common ground and to speak about Jesus and speak the gospel in a way that would be intelligible to people from a Greek worldview. And so he's quoting their poets, and he's not really quoting the Old Testament as we might imagine him doing in other contexts. And I think that's such a great lesson for us as we, as Christian leaders and influencers, think about the way we talk about our faith, is that you know, we can never lose sight of the fact that even people who are antagonistic toward us, who think that we have no leg to stand on, who completely disagree with our worldview, God loves those people, and he's put us in their world to be his ambassadors. And how can we articulate our faith in a way that they will hear? And I think it requires us to be creative and adaptive, and it requires us to, in some cases, put on the shelf the way we might prefer to talk about our faith, and discover a new way that they'll hear and maybe respond to. And so the quest for common ground, we see him tailoring his message to Greek and Roman context. And then when he goes into a city, if there's a Jewish synagogue, he often goes there first, because here are people who share some heritage. And so he would tailor his message to those audiences differently and begin with a discussion of the Old Testament and the prophecies about the Messiah and those sorts of things. And so I just think it's a great lesson for us today that we can't hold on too tightly to the way we talk about our faith. We have to be willing to adapt and listen to people from different backgrounds and articulate the gospel in a way that they might hear, that might be surprising to them.
Well, and again, as you said, tailor the message, because sometimes we have people say, well, it's the changeless message of the gospel. Yes, but it is communicated in changing circumstances. And if you look at Acts 13, he's in a synagogue, and what can he assume? Well, they're all Jews. They all believe in the Old Testament. Many of them memorized much of the Old Testament. They believe in a coming Messiah. They believed in one true God. So he really kind of hits the ground running. In Acts 17, where we're talking about here, can he assume any of that? No, they believed in multiple gods. They didn't probably know anything about the Old Testament, don't know who Jesus is, don't know who resurrection is. I mean, to use my teenage daughter's favorite word, they were clueless. And so he has to back up and explain it. And I'd have to say today, Ryan, our culture is much more of an Acts 17 culture. The culture of your grandparents was more of an Acts 13 culture, don't you think?
I think so. I mean, just the changing cultural landscape of our country and just the interconnectedness that's come through social media and other places. There's just much more of a marketplace of ideas, and Athens was the center of the universe for that kind of thing in the Roman world. It was the place of the exchange of ideas and learning and thinking. And Luke, even in his description in Acts 17 of the climate of Athens, kind of makes this tongue-in-cheek comment about, they just want to hear the latest ideas. That's all they do in Athens, is just talk about the latest ideas. And I think we're in an environment like that. You're right. We're, a generation ago, you mainly still, even as modern as it was 30, 40 years ago, still, the people you mainly interact with are the people you happen to go to church with or who live on your street or your family, the friends you happen to have. That was mainly your social world. And now with the internet and cable news and social media, it's just a completely different landscape. I think we're going to get 100 years down the road, and this era that we're living through now will be viewed as a real revolution. I mean, complete shift in the way humanity interacts. I don't even think we're really fully understanding how big of a shift it is now, because we're in the midst of it still. But yes, the world now is very analogous, I think, to the world that Paul encountered in a place like Athens. So looking at how he and his team interacted in that place and others, I think Lystra is another example of that kind of thing in the book of Acts, and other contexts. We have to look to how they did it because they set such a great example.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we might talk about collaboration. Since this book deals a lot with the issue of leadership, how about taking some individuals that, first of all, have to leave Rome, they come to Corinth, and they go to Ephesus, and what can we do and what can we learn from Paul about, for example, using Priscilla and Aquila in different contexts, and certainly some principles of leadership, that chapter in particular, finding your friends and letting them lead. Well, sometimes we can find the friends. Letting them lead, sometimes some of us are too focused on control that we can't turn over the reins, and we see some really important principles here from the Apostle Paul, so we'll talk about that. So many chapters, we won't have a chance to talk about all 11, but I wanted to pick on a few that I thought would be of interest to you. And again, it's all part of this book, Paul and His Team. It is published by Moody Press, and you should be able to find it in your bookstore, but if not, we have information about that. 200 pages, great material, and you can find out more on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute here for two very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week, we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now, 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Ryan Lokkesmoe, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It's probably a conversation where you might just want to sit back and listen, maybe take some notes, but let me just mention that if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We have a link to your website, Ryan, and again, people don't have to know how to spell your name. You've probably had to spell it more than a few times. It's already on the website, and I'm going to give people an assignment. First of all, they can get a copy of the book, But also, interestingly enough, you have almost a 4-minute video. So I'm going to encourage people to watch that video and then click the share button and maybe put it on their Facebook page or send it out as a Twitter tweet or something like that to let people know about this resource. And as we talk about it, talk again for just a minute, if you would, about how this could be used, because each one of the chapters ends with a number of discussion questions. So I think this would be ideal for a small group or a Bible study or a Sunday school class, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. That's kind of what I had in mind when I wrote the book was, that it would be great for Bible studies, small groups, because you kind of get two things with this book. On the one hand, you get kind of a nice basic historical introduction to Paul. That's not like the focus of the book, but along the way you kind of get that. So if you want to have a basic grasp of the book of Acts and how that relates to some of Paul's letters and what his ministry looked like, you really kind of get a handle on a lot of the New Testament, I think, just by reading the book. So there's kind of just that part of it, which is sort of biblical knowledge. I think you get a good amount of that just by reading the book. But the other side, which is really more the focus of the book, is I think it creates some conversations around, how are we leading in the church today? How does our influence play out in the changing landscape of our culture? And I don't mean just for pastors. I think definitely this book could be used for church staffs to go through together, or elder boards and those sorts of things as they think about kind of the formal aspects of church leadership. But I think more than that, anybody who's a parent or a coach or, just anyone, a person of faith who wants to think intentionally about how they are being a Christ-like example, I just think looking to Paul and his team is a great place to start.
Let's take a phone call along the way, because I think Terry wants to emphasize some of the things you just said. Terry in Texas, listening on KCTA. What's your point of view?
Yeah, Kirby, I got to make a comment here. It says, you can judge any man's preaching and teaching by this rule. Is he Pauline? Does his doctrine start and finish according to the statements of Christian doctrine uttered by the Apostle Paul, no matter how wonderful a man may seem in his gifts and apparent consecration? If the gospel is not Pauline, it is not the gospel. Paul calls down the anathema, that is the curse of God, upon anyone who preaches any other gospel than the one he declared. Now that's serious. It says in Romans 2:16 we're going to be judged according to Paul's gospel. It says in 1 Timothy 1:16 Paul says, howbeit for this cause I obtain mercy, that in me first, Jesus Christ might show forth all long suffering for a pattern of salvation. It says that we're going to be judged by Jesus Christ, and Paul's your pattern for salvation, and not Peter. All the churches I've visited since I've been in Texas, and I visited bunches of them, they all avoid Paul for the most part. You got several TV evangelists like Charles Stanley and Michael Youssef that they teach Paul's gospel, but I don't think they really understand that it's different than the one from Peter.
What about that? Ryan, it seems to me that we certainly can learn a lot by certainly reading the epistles of Paul and also reading the book of Acts. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Paul's gospel. I mean, we actually just went through Romans kind of chapter by chapter at our church, and the way he unfolds the gospel, the problem of sin and why it needed to be dealt with, and how everybody, no matter who you are, has to have their sin accounted for and dealt with, and that really the only answer to that is Christ. It's just incredible. I mean, and that I write about that in the book too, that, Paul, he really fought hard for a couple of things. There were a lot of challenges the church faced that he was willing to kind of let go by him, or personal attacks, but a couple of things he really fought for and would not compromise on were the gospel, and then unity in the church. And so certainly in Galatians, that's kind of front and center, that, this is the gospel. There's no other gospel. This is it. And so right. I think you're absolutely right that
and even if even if an angel were to preach another gospel.
That's right. Yeah. There is one gospel. One gospel. Anything that departs from that is a distraction and dangerous. Yeah.
Chapter 5 is on worthy conflicts, and certainly, again, making the main things the main things. But in the interest of time, since this book deals with leadership, I thought I would jump ahead to chapter 6, because you call this genuine collaboration. And here's a good example. Priscilla and Aquila find themselves in Rome. Well, they get kicked out, and we can explain, and I'll let you explain that in just a minute. They find themselves in Corinth. They're ministered to, and then eventually, as Paul heads back on the end of his second missionary journey, he travels to Ephesus, but instead of staying at Ephesus, he leaves Priscilla and Aquila. Now, to be fair, he comes back to Ephesus on his third missionary journey and spends 2 years there, but you can learn some real principles here, which you refer to, I think, so well as finding your friends and letting them lead. Sometimes we're better on the first than the second because we sometimes don't turn over the reins of leadership.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the church today, we, from a good intention, we want to raise people up and train them and disciple them to the point that we can really trust them to lead others. But I think what I see when I read Paul's letters is that there were a lot of people in his circle who were basically baby believers, and he trusted them with a lot of responsibility. And I think it's because he knew that ultimately God's the one doing the work of growing his church. He talks about that in 1 Corinthians. You know, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. And so I think Paul had such an abiding trust in the Lord that it's the Holy Spirit doing his work, that you can even trust people who are relatively new in the faith to lead well as long as they are submitting themselves to the Lord and leaning on him for their strength. And so you're right, Priscilla and Aquila, what a great example. They're in the business community in these multiple cities, and they get hooked up with Paul, and they seem to be a couple that had some financial means, and they're hosting churches in their homes, and they're uprooting their lives to move to other cities in order to continue in the ministry with Paul. And so, you know, this is a couple that he really did. He found his friends, and they worked together, and he let them lead. As you said, he left them in charge of significant ministries for a long period of time. And this is true for a lot of elements of his ministry, you know, giving Titus responsibility over the large island of Crete and dispatching Timothy and other people to other places. He really placed some trust in people. Erastus, I talk about him in that chapter 2, someone in the government sector, who, you know, seems that his entire priority of life and worldview changed because he is in Paul's corner now, and he's working in ministry. And then it seems from some comments in other letters that Erastus even left Corinth to go do ministry-related work in other places. And so, you know, Paul really entrusted relatively new believers with a lot of responsibility. And I think that speaks to us, those of us that are in church leadership today. I think it tells us we need to really probably let people lead in more significant ways earlier than we might be inclined to do, which you know, I think we do grasp onto control, or we want to just check all the boxes before we really let somebody lead. I think Paul sets an example that we probably need to hold on to that a little more loosely and really empower people to lead. And I think also for people who aren't technically in a position of leadership in the church, they should be willing to step up and find their place to lead because God might have a really important purpose for them.
You know, you mentioned Erastus just before we take a break. Let me mention that because one of the things we talk about is not only helping you articulate a biblical worldview, but know how to defend it. And that's what we call the area of apologetics. And when I came to Greece, fortunately, I didn't have to go through what you and your wife had to go through trying to find it, because as we get there, you go to Corinth and you see the Arch of Corinth and you're saying, okay, we need to go over there. And he's taking us down you know what it's like. It's kind of like this goat path. And I'm going, where are we going? Well, then he goes to show us the inscription Erastus on that particular pavement. And it really wasn't until I think it was about the 1930s that we ever had any archaeological evidence that Erastus, who's a mention, for example, in Acts 19, and is actually one of the individuals that Paul sends forward. And so it's just a good example of now we have so often found these archaeological evidences of the historical accuracy of Luke, because as you well know as a person, as a New Testament scholar, if there's anything that the skeptical world wants to shoot out, it's Luke. You know, is Luke accurate in the gospel? Is Luke accurate in the book of Acts? And the good news is, as we come to a break here, archaeology once again proves the Bible is true and the skeptics were wrong. We'll take a break. There's a lot more to talk about in the book. Paul and his team will do that that right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At this point, it's an all too familiar story. A same-sex couple asks a religious baker to custom create a wedding cake. Despite apologetically declining the business, the baker is sued and the bakery is forced to close. But this is not that story. Not yet, anyway. Kathy Miller is the religious baker, and her bakery, called Tastries, is located in Bakersfield, California. She was forced to decline some business when that client would have required her to use her creative expression to lend support to a union that violates her religious convictions. The couple filed a complaint, and the state of California filed suit against Kathy. But Judge David Lamp concluded that the state has an obligation to protect free speech for everyone, including Kathy. The court reasoned that while everyone should be able to purchase ready-made goods regardless of what the customer plans to do with the goods, custom art is different. Or, as the ACLU says, freedom of expression for ourselves requires freedom of expression for others. You see, the true test of whether we actually believe in the promise of the First Amendment is speech we find socially controversial. Popular ideas are not in great danger of being suppressed or silenced. The true test of our commitment to freedom is if we welcome that disagreement and live peaceably as neighbors anyway. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
All listeners out there, I've been listening for over 2 years. I just recently became a supporter. So I'm a proud supporter of Point of View, and so I would just encourage everyone who listens to this radio station and to your specific broadcast, because it has been so influential for me, and I refer people to it because you put out such great information, and it's so thought-invoking and conversation-stimulating. It's great. So thank you so much, and I'll continue to support you guys.
But I've decided I'm going to give Point of View something this year because I think financially we're doing better. Point of View is one of, in my opinion, 2 or 3 places where you can really get this kind of information, and it is sorely lacking in our culture. And so Point of View, and there's a couple other programs, if we don't support them, I'm not convinced those messages will get out.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
You can find out a little bit more about joining the Truth Team at our website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can also find out about Ryan and his ministry. We have a link to his website. And again, let me encourage you to watch the video and then maybe click that share button and put it on your Facebook page, or maybe send it out as an email and educate some more people about this book, Paul and his team, 11 chapters with some great discussion questions at the end. I would highly recommend it to those of you that would want to understand more about the book of Acts. And so, again, great resources. And even though, of course, he received his PhD, this is not an academic book. It's very readable. But let me, for just a minute, Ryan, since you did do your PhD on a particular topic, go to chapter 7, because this deals with Philemon and Onesimus, and it's what you call kingdom diplomacy, building bridges across cultural chasms. No bigger chasm than Roman slavery. So what from your doctoral dissertation did you learn, and what can we learn by reading that particular chapter?
Sure. So, yeah, as you just mentioned, this massive chasm in the first century world was between slave and free. Many people became slaves back then for different reasons than we might think of. Being Americans, back then it was usually if you lost in war. If you were born to a slave mother, you were a slave. Scholars debate the exact percentage, but many would say 30% plus or minus of the Roman Empire were slaves. And they really were not thought of as people. You have these philosophers, people like Aristotle and others, speaking about slaves as tools that can talk. I mean, they were just completely dehumanized.
Yes.
And so, you look at a letter like Philemon, it's 335 words. It's this little letter tucked in the New Testament there. And you have Paul speaking into a situation where you have a Christian slave owner and his fugitive slave, and fugitive slaves were routinely killed for running away. It was a deterrent. And Paul has been instrumental in this runaway slave, Onesimus, becoming a Christian, and he's sending him back to his master. I mean, a lot of slaves would never do that because they would, face death for having run away. But Paul's going to cast a new vision. He's going to say, because of Christ, all of these differences between you that society says are so great, they evaporate in the face of the gospel. And he, view him as a brother when he comes home and treat him like you would treat me. And what I love about this letter, Paul says in Galatians, there's no slave or free, Jew or Gentile, male or female. We're all one in Christ. So that kind of statement is kind of Paul preaching. Philemon, the letter Philemon, is kind of Paul practicing what he preaches. It's us, a fly on the wall of a real situation. What does it look like to reach across these chasms and bring restoration and unity in spite of what the culture says? And so when you understand how awful the situation was for slaves in the first century, a lot of the divisions in our culture today pale in comparison in their severity. And so if Paul is willing to speak into that situation and say, even in this wide of a gulf, Christ can bridge that chasm and give you a new sense of identity and purpose, then we should look around our communities to people who think differently than us, look differently from a different, cultural context, whatever it is, and instead of seeing them as people who are different or we could never have anything in common with them, to think, you know what, Jesus wants to break down these barriers, and he wants to build his kingdom out of people who are united by him in spite of whatever categories we might fall into based on our culture. And so it's just a very inspiring and challenging moment in the first century church that I think we have to look to, especially in our very fraught and divided time that we find ourselves in.
You do talk about the fact that this could even have personal application, because I'd never really thought about it, but for Onesimus to actually flee, he probably had to steal from Philemon in order to finance his flight. And then you have Paul telling Philemon to cease viewing Onesimus as a slave. So even for things like, just think of any of our listeners right now that have had something stolen from them. Maybe it's money stolen from them, their virginity stolen from them, their innocence stolen from them. That, in some respects, this is a book that hardly ever is used in biblical application, but because of your doctoral dissertation and because really of even your chapter in this book, I began to see how that particular, and it's very small, it only takes up about a half a page in our Bibles, could be very useful in terms of a practical biblical application, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I think one of the challenge is, particularly in the American evangelical churches, is often because we're such an individualistic culture, we tend to think of the gospel's relevance as being mainly about our own personal individual salvation. So I hear the gospel, I believe it, and then that's sort of the end of the story. I'm getting into heaven now. But when you read Paul and you read really the whole New Testament, you see that the gospel, it is the power of God, as he says in Romans, and it continues to mold and shape us throughout our life. We never outgrow the gospel message. Paul says to the Romans, I can't wait to come preach the gospel to you. And these are already believers. So the gospel has continued relevance for our personal sanctification, our growth throughout our life, but also it propels us to look outward. In the same way that Jesus loved sacrificially, it should propel us to look around in our communities and our world and love sacrificially. And part of that is to be mindful of just the divisions in our culture, the prejudices we might have, and be honest about those and say, you know what, the gospel, because God reached so far to me and rescued me because of his love, I am now, as a reflection of that, meant to reach across whatever barriers there are and find unity and hope and restoration. I mean, Paul talks about this in Ephesians 2 as well, the Jews and Gentiles being brought together. They used to be apart, but now because of Christ, they are one. And I think this example of Onesimus and Philemon is just a shining example of how far the gospel can go to build bridges. And the fact that we have the letter, scholars aren't for sure, but the fact that it wound up in the New Testament, I think it's probable that Philemon, followed Paul's advice and may have freed his slave. We're not sure exactly what happened. But if he had responded negatively, it probably would not have into the New Testament. So it's a great example for us.
Well, Ryan, I appreciate you writing the book. And again, I would recommend it to our listeners. 200 pages, published by Moody. You can find it in a local bookstore. Of course, we also have a link to your website. And thank you so very much for giving us an hour today here on Point of View to talk about Paul and his team.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, third hour today, we will spend some time looking at some archaeological evidence, some very significant religious liberty threats, and some issues of moral reasoning and ethics. We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute here for two very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week, we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. This is going to be an open line this hour, a chance to look at a variety of different issues. First of all, I'm going to focus on some religious liberty issues. Now, oftentimes we like to move those to Friday, but first of all, we won't have Kelly Shackelford with us on Friday anyway, and I think some of these are important enough that they need to be talked about today. So even though it's Tuesday and we're many days away from the Friday focus on religious liberty, we will do so. Then I thought it would be kind of fun to point out how ISIS has accidentally confirmed and corroborates the Bible. That's some new archaeological evidence, a classic illustration of you meant it for evil, but God used it for good. So we'll get into that a little bit later this hour. Then I want to get into some of the ethical issues. And just before we're done, I thought it might be good to focus on the Second Amendment, our latest booklet, which we make available to those of you that join the Truth Team at $45 a month, is that. And there are some commentaries I've done on this and some other issues. Along the way, we'll probably also talk about the fact that Starbucks is closing down one day, all their stores, closing them all down to do re-education. That gets us into the whole issue of Starbucks and racial profiling, and we have a lot to cover. So if any of those issues are of interest to you, we welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Let me take one of these religious liberty issues, and it has to do with our good friends at the Family Research Council. Tony Perkins and the people there have asked us to be praying for them, and the reason for that is very simple. Tony says, you may recall that last July, President Trump kept his pledge to end the Obama era of social experimentation in our nation's armed forces, moving away from political correctness and putting the focus on military's mission of preparing to fight and win wars. He announced that the military would return to the status quo of not allowing individuals to serve who identify as transgender. Well, again, we can have that discussion, but that discussion probably should take place in Congress, the halls of Congress, not be implemented unilaterally by the previous president, Barack Obama. Okay. We can get into whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and, of course, we'll welcome those phone calls, too. But here's the issue. He said, despite fierce pushback from the LGBT activist groups, the Department of Defense released their report last month reinforcing the administration's commitment to implementing policies that are essential to keeping our military strong and our country safe. Upset by these actions, groups like the National Center for Lesbian Rights and the GLBTQ legal advocates and defenders have resorted to one of their favorite avenues to impose their agenda, the court system. And so he said, last fall, these activists sued the Trump administration to put on hold the policy change, which is their right. But now he says that the Family Research Council has found that there have been subpoenas actually sent to them demanding that this would be the Family Research Council produce all communications on the topic between the senior leaders at the Family Research Council and the administration. And so Tony Perkins said we've had to hire a law firm to represent us in this case, and our lawyers have objected to the demand for all that information, asserting their First Amendment religious freedom and speech rights. And the LGBT activist groups have now filed a motion seeking a court order compelling us to turn over these privileged documents. Now, Tony Perkins said, let me be clear, the purpose of these subpoenas are not to resolve any constitutional questions. Their intent is clear: to intimidate the Family Research Council and our supporters from standing up for our military service members. They also know that it takes significant time and resources to respond to subpoenas. Scarce time and resources, we should be focusing on advancing faith, family, and freedom. So he then concludes by saying, you know, for 35 years, we've stood alongside everyday Americans who've been targeted for their faith, and he gives a couple of examples. One example, he talks about the so-called Houston Five. That was a diverse group of pastors who back in 2014, you might remember, had their communications and sermons subpoenaed by the city's former mayor when they stood for biblical truth regarding gender and sexuality against her LGBT special rights ordinance. You might remember they had this special ordinance in Houston. It actually was defeated, and so then the next action was she then subpoenaed those pastors to turn over their sermons and other communication. What happened is a number of the pastors said, oh, you want our sermons? We'll be glad to send them to you. And, of course, real quickly, there's sort of a back down. But that was one of the cases. The other one he talks about, of course, is one we've talked about on this program, the Colorado baker Jack Phillips, as the State Civil Rights Commission fought him all the way to the Supreme Court because he stood by his deeply held religious beliefs and politely declined to bake a cake celebrating a same-sex wedding. And then another one we just talked about last week, interestingly enough, he also uses the example of Air Force Colonel Leland Bohannon, who was suspended from duty for his decision not to sign a certificate of appreciation for a same-sex spouse. Now, you might remember that he didn't prevent that from happening. He actually sought a remedy, which I think was a good one because he would have been a brigadier general, a one-star general, but so he had a two-star general sign the certificate of appreciation. So it's not like they did not give one. As a matter of fact, he went one step higher and gave them something that might have been even more valuable in the eyes of that same-sex partner, but that was not enough, and so they did all they could to sort of ruin his career. And as Tony Perkins points out, with the help of 77,000 petitions from engaged believers like you, the Air Force Secretary just this month overturned the punishment against him and upheld his freedom to live according to his beliefs. So his record has been expunged, and no doubt he will actually eventually, when he does retire at that high rank that he certainly deserved in the midst of all that. So again, Tony Perkins concludes by saying, if standing up against injustice stirs your heart, we now need you to stand with FRC, so we would encourage you to be in prayer about Family Research Council, and in the next couple of weeks we'll do an update on what we know. But when we come back from the break, I also want to focus on something else. No doubt, if you're in a church right now, you have a pastor who receives what is called a housing allowance, and that has been declared unconstitutional in one federal district court. That's in the state of Wisconsin. Well, now it's seemingly expanded a little bit. And so what we're going to do when we come back from the break is I'm going to read from our good friend John Stonestreet, who, by the way, has said some very nice things about Point of View this week. And he actually, in his commentary, his Breakpoint commentary, actually has talked about how the Freedom from Religion Foundation has targeted what's called the Ministerial Housing Allowance Exemption, and how that is going to be, I think, one of the next battles, which would affect you if you're a pastor, or affect your church, because your church no doubt has a pastor. Most pastors do take a housing allowance and do have that exemption. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Then we'll move on to some other topics. But I just thought I'd give you an advance warning as we get into a couple of these religious liberty cases. Then we're going to talk about a few other topics that are in the news as well. But if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisers they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Hey, this is John Stonestreet, the host of Breakpoint and the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. As a champion of Christians thinking clearly about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview, there are a few people that I look to for more clarity and confidence and providing clear answers to the big questions that our culture is asking. And Kerby Anderson, I love what happens on Point of View each and every day. And anytime I get the opportunity to be a guest on the program, I always think that Kerby is the best interviewer in the business. I encourage you to support Point of View with your prayers and with your financial support.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
John Stonestreet, and by the way, he actually has produced a commentary today that we're going to read from, but we're reminding you of the fact that you can still join with us on the Truth Team, and I believe we might have just a little bit of match money left over, and then we'll be done. And so, again, anything you can do to help us clear that up, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention the pledge line, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. And again, as you join with us, you help us bring these programs every single day. And let's, if we can, now hear from John Stonestreet, because his commentary today is entitled Freedom from Religion and Your Pastor's Taxes. It turns out that the Freedom from Religion Foundation has decided to target the ministerial housing tax exemption. And, of course, the first volley of that took place last October. That's when a federal district court judge in Wisconsin ruled that the tax exemption for ministerial housing allowances is an unconstitutional establishment of religion. And, of course, I'm quoting there from John Stone Street. He says the ruling came in response, of course, to the challenge from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Though the dollar amount is pretty small, the impact of ending the exemption could be significant, not only for the clergy, but for the entire country. And so he goes into some detail and says, here's the deal. First of all, the Internal Revenue Code exempts the value of housing provided for what calls ministers of the gospel from gross income for purposes of income tax. The exemption also covers non-Christian clergy. It covers both rental value of the home if provided by a congregation or an allowance paid to the minister in lieu of providing housing. And so you've had a couple of those situations. For many of the individuals in the past, this was a parsonage that was provided. And you might remember when we've had O.S. Hawkins on this program with Guidestone, he's oftentimes talked about the fact that the revenue from and the profits from some of the books he's published go to a fund to help, in most cases, widows and widowers, but a lot of these widows who find themselves in a difficult situation. They've been in the ministry, they've been preaching the Word of God, and they've been in a parsonage. But, of course, by being in a parsonage, they've never been able to, build any kind of asset, any kind of equity. So when it came to time to retire from ministry, they are living on Social Security, and they don't have a house, and so they have to live in an apartment, or maybe sometimes some of the various ministries or churches or denominations provide some kind of housing for them. And so this exemption is something that really kind of allows for them to actually have a house that they could then live in once they've retired, or maybe even sell but have some equity for that. And anyway, going back to John Stone Street's piece, he says the exemption predates the Internal Revenue Code, which was enacted in 1954. In fact, its origins have little to do with religion. It grew out of what is known as the convenience of the employer doctrine. What is that? Well, this doctrine applied to employees who had very little say in the place of their residence or where they ate their meals. And this, for example, affects obviously ministers, but the doctrine has benefited others like ranch hands, innkeepers, military personnel, even the President of the United States, interestingly enough. So by allowing ministers, he says, to take the housing allowance exemption, Congress wasn't establishing religion at all. It was ending a kind of discrimination against religion. It was putting pastors on the same footing as any other similarly situated employees. And it's important to note the exemption only applies to income tax. The ministerial housing allowance isn't exempt from self-employment taxes, so, things like Social Security or Medicare, whatever it might be. And he said we should note many ministers, unlike the rest of us, pay both the employee and the employer's share of these taxes. In other words, they're already being taxed at 15.3% on their housing allowance. Overturning Section 107, which is part of the Internal Revenue Code, without taking into account the self-employment tax issue would recreate the problem that Congress tried to fix with the housing allowance in the first place. Namely, ministers would be uniquely disadvantaged tax-wise. So imposing an additional financial burden on ministries would be especially devastating to smaller and poorer churches, which are, by the way, the majority of churches in America, where the housing allowance might even be the bulk of the minister's compensation. By the way, I do know of one individual in the past that I met whose entire compensation was the housing allowance. In other words, he basically never paid taxes, in a sense, because his income was the same as his housing allowance. How he made that work, I never figured that out, but that's okay. And of course, some of these are bivocational ministers where they work 5 days a week and then they preach on Sunday. So, again, that's another issue. But nevertheless, back to John Stone Street before we take a break. He says, in other words, the Wisconsin judge's ruling would remedy a non-existent establishment of religion problem by creating real-world free exercise problems. And that's probably what the people who are challenging the exemption want in the first place. To create a world free from religion requires denying and diminishing the impact of faith in our society. And so, again, John Stone Street says, I don't mean just the intangible benefits, as important as those are, but the material and social benefits. He says the economic contribution of religious bodies to the American economy has been estimated over $1 trillion. We've talked about this on the program before when we've had Dr. Rodney Stark on the program and a variety of other people that have documented the same thing. John Stonestreet goes on to say substantial portions of the care provided and delivered to the poor and needy Americans come from religious people working through their congregations and other ministries. Those of you that in the Texas audience might have had a chance to hear about the interview we did with Scott Sheppard, and those of you that are in the national audience could go back and listen to that and find out there's a good example there. And then John Stonestreet says, let's go on. Think of the schools, the hospitals, the shelters, the food banks, and on and on. Those who want churches out of the public square are, as he says, out of their minds if they think the government can provide all the services that churches and religious organizations perform. And he says by now the ruling has not taken effect and is being appealed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's where I and our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom are asking you to jump in. Alert your pastor or minister. Tell them to go to ministerhousing.com and sign on as a friend of the court brief and let the court know how important this ministerial housing allowance really is. So again, there's an action there, and they're really asking people to take action before August 23rd, so I'm giving you about a week's notice. And so if you are a pastor, you may want to go to that website. If you know a pastor, you might want to tell them about that. And most importantly, as we come to a break here, I think I'll open up the phones because maybe some of you have some comments already about this issue of religious liberty. That is certainly important for us to talk about, but also I would like to hear your comments on some of the other topics we've put on the table. And before we're done, I'm going to talk about how the actions of ISIS sometimes inadvertently or accidentally corroborates the Bible. Fascinating material. And more importantly, I think before we end today, need to also point out the fact that those of you that love Starbucks, Andrew, are you paying attention? All the Starbucks stores will be closed on May 29th for racial bias education. It's only the second time they've closed down these Starbucks stores, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that as well. So, as always, we have lots to cover, but I'd love to get your comments as well. If you'd like to join us on air, I haven't done a very good job of actually encouraging you to give us a phone call. So this last half hour, we're going to leave it as an open line, although I do want to maybe cover 2 or 3 more stories if we can. That number is 800-351-1212. And don't forget that as you go to our website, you will find some of the information we're talking about here today. But more importantly, I think it's also important for at least 1 or 2 of you, if you have not already joined the Truth Team, I'd love to get at least 1 or 2 of you before the end of this hour to join our Truth Team. For as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you can help us out, and we would greatly appreciate that. Just simply go to pointofview.net, click on that button that says Join Now, and we certainly encourage your response. But again, we'll take some of those phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. What are your thoughts about some of the issues we've talked about? We'll take some of those calls and continue our conversation right after this.
One minute. Give me 1 minute here for 2 very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week, we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Got some interesting things from archaeology. We'll talk about Starbucks and a few others, but let's take some phone calls first. California, KNLB. Wilbert, you have the floor. What's your point of view?
Hi, Kerby. Yeah, I'm a Christian, and, I served in armed forces. But anyway, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is a religion, and they also use the freedom of press. They use the freedom of their speech, and they can only do it in American borders. And they use a lot of the speech and the freedom of the press a lot, but their religion is just what their words are, Freedom from the Religion Foundation. They have to do that, and they're not a part of the government, so they have to do that. And that was my comment, so I just want to share that with you.
Well, I think it's a good one. There was a Supreme Court decision years ago where in a footnote it even suggested that even secular humanism could be a religion. Now, my secular friends say, no, we're not religious. We're not religious at all. But if you take religion as what is your worldview, your ultimate commitment, you could even have kind of a secular religion. And think about this. I mean, I don't want to overplay this too much, but I have run into Buddhists that basically are atheists. So they follow the Buddhist religion, in quotes, but they don't believe in God. So when people that are with the Freedom from Religion Foundation or Americans for the Separation of Church and State or a variety of other groups say, well, we're not religious, well, I think you could make a case that they are. Whether they are or not, I think Wilbur makes another point. They're enjoying that First Amendment, which provides freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press. But when it comes to freedom of religion, I don't know. We don't have anything about that. So, good point. So, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, and I think it might be helpful. And we may come back to this on our Friday weekend edition to talk about whether or not this whole ministerial housing tax exemption is under threat and what we might want to do about that. But let me for just a minute, I thought this would be kind of a little bit of a break from all the news, talk about how ISIS has accidentally, or some people have said inadvertently, corroborated the Bible. And Aaron Earls, in one piece, says, when fighters for the terrorist organization ISIS destroyed numerous biblical archaeological sites in Iraq, they unknowingly unearthed evidence supporting the Old Testament accounts. Previously, archaeological teams stopped digging under certain sites in Iraq, such as the so-called traditional tomb of Jonah the prophet, because they did not want to destroy them. Well, when ISIS fighters took over Mosul and other Iraqi areas in 2014, they had no such qualms, he says. They demolished the tomb of Jonah and dug tunnels looking for buried treasure or artifacts that they could sell to finance their terrorist operations, according to the UK Telegraph. And once the Iraqi army rooted out ISIS earlier this year, archaeologists began checking these historical sites to see how much damage had been done. They began and made some very startling discoveries. The tunnels dug by the terrorist group revealed a previously untouched Assyrian palace in the ancient city of Nineveh. Of course, this is where it is believed that Jonah was buried. And these several inscriptions actually corroborate biblical accounts. For example, one of the articles in Iraq Magazine, an archaeology journal published at Cambridge University, examines some of these, and they found that the inscriptions found in the city of Nineveh give the order of the Assyrian kings that perfectly match the biblical order, where you have Sargon II, which is in Isaiah 20, then Sennacherib, which you find in 2 Kings 18, 2 Chronicles 32, and Isaiah 36 and 37, Esarhaddon, which is in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37, and then Harshnashnappal, also known as Osnapper, and a number of others you see in Ezra 4:10. So you have all of these. Also, you have some other inscriptions that confirm biblical references to the city of Keilah. You have that in Genesis 10, and even the resettlement by the Assyrians in Ezra 4:10. So that's one of the articles in Facts and Trends. There's another article that came out recently, and this one was written by Matthew Archibald, and he puts it this way. He says, irony alert. The Bible once again is shown to be historically accurate, this time with the help of ISIS militants. He says, so here's how it happened. In 2014, ISIS destroyed a site believed by many to be the burial site of Jonah in Mosul because, he says, well, that's what ISIS does. They destroy. For some reason, they went to town on the place, even using dynamite to destroy it. But a few weeks ago, the area was liberated by Iraqi forces from ISIS, but because the site was blown to smithereens, what was under the shrine became apparent. The archaeologists first discovered the 2,300-year-old palace of the biblical king Sennacherib. I know all of you read the Bible, so that's as much of the Sennacherib story as known to most of you. But just in case you forgot, according to the Bible, King Sennacherib ran a pretty wealthy city around 700 BC, and he was all about sacking towns and racking in money, typical bad guy stuff. So then he set his sights on the kingdom of Judah. The Bible states that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, advanced and invaded Judah, laid siege to the fortified towns, intending to demolish them. Not only did he do that, but he talked trash, he says, about doing it. And he goes on to talk about some of this as well. And then finally said when he realized the people would not surrender because of their faith in Yahweh, he mocked their faith. Don't you know that I and my ancestors have done to all the people of the other countries, he sneered. Have the national gods of those countries had the slightest success in saving those countries from my clutches? But because of all this, an angel came down and pretty much wiped out his army. And so for years, as you might know, much of the Bible has been dismissed, he says, as unreliable. But now it's believed we actually found Sennacherib's palace. And sadly, ISIS seems to have absconded with many of the artifacts from the site to sell for their own profit. It seems they're not big into respecting people who are alive or dead. But one archaeologist was quoted as saying, ISIS' act of destruction has actually led to a fantastic find, a find that shows the Bible to be correct once again. So that's one of those situations in which the what ISIS meant for evil, God apparently used for good. This isn't the first time, he says in this particular article, that the Bible was shown to have historical merit, despite many thinking that it's just a collection of myths. Just a few years ago, archaeologists discovered what was called the Tel Dan inscription in the 9th century BC stone, which had the first historical evidence of King David outside of the Bible. And the ancient town called Gath, ruled by the ancient Philistines and the home of Goliath, was also recently discovered. So those are just a few. And, of course, if you've been listening to the program, I've also talked about a few of the other archaeological finds, some of those that have actually come from the wall there in Jerusalem, the Western Wall, and how that has been further verification with some of those various, if you will, they look like coins or kind of like buttons that actually document this as well. So just thought it'd be fun to share a little bit more about what we've learned accidentally sometimes from archaeology simply because of the destruction brought by ISIS. But just before we go to a break, let me just mention that those of you that enjoy going to Starbucks will have to mark your calendars and not go to Starbucks on May 29th, because Starbucks said that it will close all of its U.S. stores in the afternoon, at least, of May 29th for racial bias education for its employees. This has a lot to do with, of course, the arrest of these two African Americans in that particular store in Philadelphia, and then some other similar stories that are now starting to unfold. And so what you found is that all sorts of people in positions of leadership in Starbucks are trying to see if they can head off some of the boycotts in others, and that includes the founder and executive chairman Howard Schultz and the current CEO, who is Kevin Johnson, who apologized over the weekend, called the arrest reprehensible, even offered to meet the two men to give a face-to-face apology. And here's just a few quotes from Kevin Johnson. He said, "I've spent the last few days in Philadelphia with my leadership team, listening to the community, learning what we did wrong and the steps we need to fix it. He goes on to say, while this is not limited to Starbucks, we're committed to being a part of the solution. Closing our stores for racial bias training is just one step in a journey that requires dedication from every level of our company and partnerships in local communities. And, of course, Starbucks has always been flirting with and promoting progressive ideas, and in many cases had negative things to say about some of the sort of Christian-based groups and some of that. But here, when they were facing a boycott, began to see what happens, as has happened in the past with Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby and others, when all of a sudden a group decides we're going to target you. And so Starbucks will be closing for the afternoon on May 29th. Mark your calendar in case you like Starbucks coffee. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. At this point, it's an all-too-familiar story. A same-sex couple asks a religious baker to custom create a wedding cake. Despite apologetically declining the business, the baker is sued and the bakery is forced to close. But this is not that story. Not yet, anyway. Kathy Miller is the religious baker, and her bakery, called Tasteries, is located in Bakersfield, California. She was forced to decline some business when that client would have required her to use her creative expression to lend support to a union that violates her religious convictions. The couple filed a complaint, and the state of California filed suit against Kathy. But Judge David Lamp concluded that the state has an obligation to protect free speech for everyone, including Kathy. The court reasoned that while everyone should be able to purchase ready-made goods regardless of what the customer plans to do with the goods, custom art is different. Or, as the ACLU says, freedom of expression for ourselves requires freedom of expression for others. You see, the true test of whether we actually believe in the promise of the First Amendment is speech we find socially controversial. Popular ideas are not in great danger of being suppressed or silenced. The true test of our commitment to freedom is if we welcome that disagreement and live peaceably as neighbors anyway. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Point of View is a part of my daily life, and I know of no other radio program that helps its listeners to develop, articulate, and then defend a biblical worldview as successfully as yours does. For those reasons, I consider it an honor to be able to support Point of View financially, and I would encourage all of your listeners, both young and old, to prayerfully consider doing the same.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know I was working in an abortion clinic when abortion first became legal, and I thought I was helping women. And the Lord showed me in a very powerful way, as He removed the veil from me, what exactly I'd been involved in. And I am proof of forgiveness. And I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Point of View, Truth Team 360. The future is now.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention tomorrow will be our Millennial Roundtable, and of course I will be sitting in this chair simply because Nick Pitts has some other things to do, and so we'll certainly have some millennials around the table. As a matter of fact, Jonathan Bodner will be with us, and we have Chelsea Human the first hour. Then the second hour will actually switch out, and Colonel Alan West will be with us. So we'll have all sorts of things to talk about tomorrow, and I look forward to that and hope you'll join us every single day on Point of View. By Friday, of course, we'll have our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews, I believe, will be with us. But just before we wind it down today, let me just mention that one of the things that we have been making available to those of you that join the Truth Team at the higher level is these booklets. And I'll hold them up again because this is something that has become incredibly popular. Last fall, we said, we should, if somebody wants to give $45 a month, provide more than just the Bible Stick and the Outlook magazine and all that. So we've produced ones on Sharia law, politicized culture, making your vote count, homosexual theology, privacy and surveillance, and the most recent one on the Second Amendment. And I thought for just a minute I might just say, if you want to join with us, that is a resource I would love to put in your hands. And, of course, even if you'd like this booklet, I'm sure we could probably send one to you. But even if you say, well, I would like to get all of the material that you cover, but I don't necessarily have the financial resources to do so, you might get something to write with because I pulled out just a few of the commentaries that I've done. And, of course, my commentaries are free to you. But my commentary, for example, on April 2nd was one on gun violence. And that one really looks at some of the facts and figures and statistics, which I think are important because we're starting to have this debate about the Second Amendment. Then I have one on April 4th, which was called Gunsplaining. And that's been the way in which people have reacted. Those that really believe that we should begin to limit the Second Amendment, they've said, well, you're just doing gunsplaining, which is a phrase that was used to basically say, look, you are starting to confuse us with all the facts and figures about the difference between calibers and automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons and all that, and you're just trying to confuse us. And the point I'm making there is okay, sometimes people try to do that. I'll be the first to admit. You talk about the individuals that maybe want to intimidate you, and so they'll use some kind of highfalutin language. And certainly you can begin to understand that they're really just trying to intimidate you so you would no longer have an opinion on the issue. So I understand that sometimes takes place. But what I also go on to say is, can't we at least have some people agree that some of the posters at these rallies, some of these slogans using these debates are completely inaccurate? It is not easier to buy an AR-15 than to buy Sudafed or to buy fireworks or to buy birth control pills or whatever. The NRA is not the ISIS of America and things like that. And so those are just a couple of resources that you could find and download and read and use and even pass on to others. On April 10th, I did one on fatherless shooters, and that was a conversation we had because if you might remember, we had Foster Freeze in here talking about the fact that maybe we shouldn't focus so much on the guns. We should focus on the shooters. And that particular one reminds us that of the 25 most cited school shootings since Columbine, 75% really were perpetrated by individuals from broken homes. But it's even worse than that because one psychologist, Peter Langman, points out that these are really difficult broken homes where divorce and separation and infidelity and substance abuse and criminal behavior and domestic violence and child abuse taking place. And so we've talked about Rachel's Challenge and other ways to begin to address that problem. And then my one on April 11th had to do with the Second Amendment. And some of that you can find actually included in this booklet because it's become kind of interesting that when you've had a former Supreme Court justice, and that would be John Paul Stevens, arguing that we really need to overturn the Second Amendment. In other words, we need to pass another amendment to repeal the Second Amendment. And we've done that before. We had an amendment to repeal prohibition. His argument would be that that has to take place. And the point that he was making is that this would be relatively simple. My argument in the article is, no, it would be relatively impossible because the framers of the Constitution required that an amendment to the Constitution needs to be passed by 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Does anybody seriously think that would take place? Now, some have said, well, maybe we could have a constitutional convention. Well, I don't think it's going to come up there either, and you still have to have it ratified in 3/4 of the states. It's not going to happen. So that's the point that I think you could make. But there was a bigger point, and that was his argument that actually the Second Amendment was written solely because the framers didn't want a standing army. Really? And in the piece there, I point out that James Madison in Federalist Paper number 46 talks about the fact that armed individuals were distinguished from the militia. So it's not just about the militia. Matter of fact, if you take out the words militia in the first phrase of that amendment, you would certainly have the right to keep and bear arms. Samuel Adams said the Constitution should never be construed to prevent people from the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. And then the other argument from the former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens was that really this idea of an individual right to own firearms is a new idea, that it was perpetuated by the NRA. As a matter of fact, I have a column coming out next week where some have say it's perpetuated by this one historian, who, by the way, I've had on this program. But all you have to do is go back and say, wait a minute, the Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who was really one of the better-known Supreme Court justices in the 19th century, wrote that the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has been justly considered as a palladium of the liberties of the people. And also, John Paul Stevens argued that the Second Amendment was never written to prevent government from putting limits on the kind of guns that we could own. Well, again, William Rawle, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, said no clause of the Constitution could, by any rule of construction, be conceived to give Congress a power to disarm the people. The point I'm making is there's 4 articles or commentaries that are on our website, and you certainly can access those free of charge. And that's one of the things we make available to you. So if you find yourself in a discussion about Sharia law, in a discussion about privacy or homosexuality or Second Amendment, or the next one coming out on capitalism and socialism, we have resources for you. And we want to equip you. We want to educate you. We want to empower you. We want to do all we can so we can turn you into advocates for faith, family, and freedom. That's what we do here at Point of View. So again, if you've not joined the Freedom Club and the whole idea of the Truth Team, join with us. Stand for freedom, stand for truth, and you can do that by going to the website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, and we'll come back tomorrow right here on our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute here for 2 very important points. First, Point of View listeners have worked and prayed for a long time, and a number of cultural victories appear to be within reach. Last week was huge. Many joined the Truth Team to be the change America needs to help finish these battles. If you gave, thank you. Thank you very much. And second, if you did not step up yet, you still have a chance to do something powerful. Last week, we received a $46,000 challenge gift that doubled gifts up to the total. We ended the week just short of that goal. But the donor now agreed to a brief extension. But listen, we don't get the match until we pass the finish line. Help us complete the challenge. Visit today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. You can be the difference. Push us across the line. Step up now, 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.